Today we're at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, so grab a cup of tea or a coffee and put your feet up because this is not going to be a short video. The Ashmolean Museum is one of the grand old museums of the world. It was founded by Elias Ashmole as his cabinet of curiosities and donated to the University of Oxford in 1677. Yes, there are older museums in the world. There was even a museum in Mesopotamia in 530 BC. But as existing museums go, the Capitoline Museums and the Vatican Museums in Rome, they didn't open to the public till well after the Ashmolean opened. And the Ashmolean is the oldest museum in Britain and one of the very oldest in the world, and has an excellent collection, particularly of archaeological finds from the ancient world. It's a must-see if you have any interest in Greek, Roman, ancient Egyptian. Particularly, I love the section on the Minoan civilization. So, not hanging around, as we come in, we turn left into this side corridor, and it is completely full of monumental sculptures. These particular sculptures were collected by lords and upper class gentlemen on a grand tour in Italy and Greece, and they formed private collections that were later donated to the Ashmolean. You could see various emperors and gods, deities, reliefs of the horses there riding dynamically along the stone in that lightly raised relief. And they're all beautifully presented with a very good explanation of each piece in terms of how it was found, who found it and donated it to the museum, and the meaning and origin. I mean, I love that sculpture there of him fighting the bear. I assume that's Hercules. Tell me if I'm wrong. And various beautiful reliefs here. Look at this. This is from Germanicus's tomb. Germanicus Julius Caesar was a Roman general and politician who was in the Claudian line and was actually adopted by his paternal uncle Tiberius, who was a great general, fought 3 campaigns in Germany, never captured a whole of Germany because it wasn't thought worth the effort, and was highly honoured when he died by the populace and I believe the Senate. And here, this beautiful bust. Look at the quality of the carving. Even the curls and locks of hair, it's exquisite work. When you think this is 2,000 years old, there even the curvature of the breastplate and again the hair and beard. You can see a sneaky peek off to the side there of the Egyptian and Levant. Beautiful Grecian work. This stone throne to like seat to various statues of senators and gods and goddesses and famous Romans and Greeks. Very beautiful room. Very striking with this strong back colour. I know this is quite new, they've repainted it like this, but I think this harkens back to the origins of the museum. There's a certain aesthetic to old museums where you can see bold colours and patterns were seen as perfectly acceptable in a museum, not the kind of white, sterile, almost magnolia backgrounds that you get in a lot of museums, so that you look at the pieces, not the museum. But this reminds me quite a bit, if you've seen our video of the Sedgwick Museum, which is sort of Cambridge's equivalent of this, an excellent collection in an exquisite building. This is probably a halfway house on those, but I do like the bold background colours here. And this room's a very striking introduction to the Ashmolean before we dive into some of the other archaeological finds here. And in the middle, this lovely Egyptian mummy, but if you look at the pattern on it, there's this beautiful, almost geometric, it almost looks like an Escher sketch with the perspective and depth. But you can immediately see it's not really an Egyptian mummy in the true sense. And the same here. Now, you don't have the same pattern work on it, but the faceplate, this is very much from the post-Pharaonic era where the Greeks and Romans were ruling Egypt and adopted some of the practices. And we're into the Egyptian gallery. There's a very good explanation there at the beginning, and quite a fascinating statue here. I didn't really get it in on the camera, but it's almost naive art, the McGregor man here. A very figurative statue, not really like a lot of more realistic Egyptian pieces. Like there you can see a piece of ibis, but McGregor man is pre-dynastic burial. And here a large collection of items, particularly interesting those bowls there. Statue of King, yes, again. So now you're into the dynastic era. You can see the Pharaonic headdress, but notice it doesn't have the sun disk or cobra, which denote the upper and lower nomes of Egypt. So you're talking very much a pre-dynastic fleece, I believe, or certainly very early days of Egyptian civilization. And along this wall there's a beautiful collection of Egyptian pottery. Quite different styles from, yes, there's different functions in terms of the bowls, but look at the difference in the pattern work. Particularly like these pieces. Almost reminds me of some of the Aztec pottery that you see if you get to a museum in America. Of Mesoamerican two-tone. And this lovely fish. Hippopotamus there. An ostrich egg that's been hollowed out. Various pieces of jewellery. Still very early pieces here. See the use of shells as jewellery. These small statuettes, not Shabti, these are before Shabti. These are representations of humans and gods, but not really as clear as to what they are. And here are these beautiful combs. If you find old combs interesting, check out the Pit Rivers. Now this is a beautiful piece, very striking. It's a palette. It reminds me of the Nama palette in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which shows the unification of North and South. But you could see these vivid, geometrically balanced images of antelope and ibis and various animals from Egypt. On the back wall, some lovely tapestries there. I don't believe those are original, but they look quite pleasant with this. And over here, I at first thought this was a vase, but as you move around, it's actually got these intricate images on the surface, and it's a mace head. And I find this very interesting because ceremonial mace heads, you see them across the ancient world. If you watched our video on the Wiltshire Museum 2 or 3 weeks ago, we actually saw much less elaborate mace heads from Wiltshire. And they were symbols of power, much like the mace in the House of Commons in Britain today, or the ones carried at a royal celebration, like a coronation. Here, series of interesting pieces of bronze and carving. See the monkey god there, the baboon, along with some more, well, naive art style god statues, which look a little bit more like the Mycenaean pieces we'll see later on. Through here, a series of portions of temples and tombs. Picture there of the step pyramid at Saqqara. If you ever get the chance to go there, it's a fascinating space around it where the Jubilee celebrations of his 40th anniversary as Pharaoh were held. And here are some original pieces from Saqqara. You're already seeing what we'd more think of as Egyptian civilization today in terms of the hieroglyphs and the style of drawings, the beautiful tiles, much more precise and elaborate statues there. There's actually a little statuette in a stone box outside of the step pyramid of Djoser, and you can peer through a hole and see him inside. The real one's in the Egyptian Museum, but there's a replica. And that's actually how we know it as Djoser's step pyramid. Really excellent example of a statue, this pottery lion. It's a sort of terracotta pottery, but it's a beautifully detailed piece. An interesting piece on the White Temple of Saharwet. If you actually go to Thebes in the Temple of Karnak, it's towards the back, I think, to the right of the Grand Lake. There's a really lovely collection here again of temple architecture pieces from the wall, because you often see pictures of temples like Karnak and Luxor, and they have the elaborate, beautifully detailed and precise hieroglyphs and pictographic depictions of events, but you don't have that colour on them. If you go to Medinet Habu on the west bank, that was buried in sand and the paint was preserved, and it really looks gorgeous there. I love this boat, lovely funeral boat. I mean, I assume that's a funeral boat from a temple. At one point, when the Grand Pyramid was built, there were boat pits next to those three pyramids, and one of them was preserved enough and has been rebuilt, and you can walk around it, and it's a magnificent boat. But after that, if you're being buried in the Valley of the Kings and you've got 3 or 4 rooms, there's not room for a massive boat. So the same as Shabtis represented your servants, you could have a model of a boat representing your boat. A sort of metaphorical description of your requirements and possessions. A beautiful funerary temple, and you can see the raised relief of the gods and Pharaoh and, I presume, priests. A very beautiful piece. Not sure what the niche in the back there is for, because there is a statue on the inside. Lovely Horus. Ptah. Pharaoh, I believe. Someone making a libation or offering. And the papyrus image there. Very interesting piece here. A ram with the pharaoh between his legs. Actually, if you go to Karnak, there's a long parade of about 40 of them as a processional avenue into, I think, from the royal palace, which is long lost, through to the Temple of Karnak, although much of it is now buried underneath the town of Thebes. And as a good example, if you see our video on the British Museum, the first of those videos, here are a series of funeral items from a group burial, because they weren't all pharaohs. They didn't all get a pyramid or a buried tomb. Even before the pyramids, there were mastabas, or it's Arabic for bench, a bench tomb. And before that were pit burials and pot burials. If you see our video on the Petrie Museum, they have an excellent pot burial, probably the best pot burial I've seen. Although, I did see one recently, I think at the Fitzwilliam, and it'll be in that video. Here you can see a tablet with an inscription, tools, pots. They're to a lower standard than those for the pharaoh, but they're still excellent pieces of craftsmanship. And here we see some shabtis. Now, the Petrie definitely has the best collection of shabtis I've seen, and it was hard to do justice to it on video, but certainly outside of Egypt, one of the best places to see them. Shabtis, think of them a bit like the terracotta army in China. You can't take your whole army with you, so bury pottery statues of your soldiers and your chariots and their horses. Well, the Egyptians had a similar approach. You need people to bathe your feet, to cook your food, to plant the seed and grow the crops and defend you from people and entertain you with music and pray for you, and all these different roles that servants would fulfill. A shabti could be a spiritual representation of that. And here, a lot of pots, and very interesting piece in the middle there. That bird really stands out. I believe it's an incense. But such a beautiful piece for what, a 3,500-4,000-year-old piece of metalwork in such excellent condition. Partly it's because you see a hoard from 600, 700, 1,000 years ago in Britain. There's plenty of them in the British Museum. They've been sitting in wet, damp, dark soil here, whereas in Egypt they've been sitting in dry sand with quite a high level of salt. Sort of drains it out, and they don't really get that same level of damage. Beautiful cabinet here of gods. Bashtet, Ptah, Amun, Amun-Ra, Isis, Osiris, Anubis. Really lovely collection. Yeah, very, very interesting collection. A little bit of one of everything. All from different burials, I believe, but quite a striking collection. I actually have something similar, but with the reconstructions they sell in the bazaar in Egypt. I think every tourist comes back with them. Lovely statue there of Amun back past the temple. One of the better temples I've seen in a museum. Metropolitan Museum in New York has probably the undisputably best one that you'll see outside of Egypt. Now into a section on mummification. You can see the mummy buried within a coffin, within a second coffin, within a sarcophagus, and all the different inscriptions and patterns, and on the top those beautiful wooden statuettes of Horus guarding the body. But always interesting. We see our video on the British Museum. We went through the Egyptian mummy room, and there's about 40 of these. And this is a person of fairly low standing, minor nobility, by no means a pharaoh. Here, life after death. You can see items they took to the tomb from the mirror there. It's lost its luster, but polished. It would have been a brass or copper mirror. The small vials for liquid and rare oils. And these pillows, those were pillows. Before you had duck down, you had hard carved wood that you'd rest your head on. Here you have canopic jars. Normally there'd be 4 canopic jars, and they would have 4 different gods on there. And they were for holding the liver, the heart, the brain, the lungs. Little funeral boats again. And a farm. So that's like having a farm in your tomb, so you're not going to go hungry. Series of shabtis and deities, religious items, along with a coffin cover there, or mummy cover, I guess you would call that, with the hieroglyphs down the centre. Isis opening her wings. She was the key part of the creation of the world. And again, different buildings and servants. Think of this as your estate. Your estate puts the food on your table in the country house. Well, you need to take it with you. And then there's a very interesting piece on Amarna. Amarna's quite a striking period. There was a break from the traditional dynastic approach, and he's sometimes put forward as this sort of Jesus Christ type figure that said there's one God, whereas I see him in a very different way. I see him as a rather weird psychopathic pharaoh who saw himself as God before his death. And Akhenaten is always pictured looking very strange. If you've ever watched an episode of Ancient Aliens, he looks like one of those. And they have, on the wall you can see that in the shape of his face. And these are pieces from Amarna, which the city was deserted and pretty destroyed after his death, and his whole religious perspective was discredited and disowned and really forgotten to time. But to see a collection from Amarna is very interesting. And it is fragments, but it's not exactly on the main tourist trail if you go to Egypt, the way that Saqqara, Cairo, Thebes. And here's what he looked like. You see that strange, long face. And there's probably 2 perspectives on that. One was that he wanted to look unhuman because he was a god. And the other is that if you sleep with your sister for 100 generations, that's how you end up looking. Pharaohs wanted to preserve the purity of their families and tended to marry their relatives for, well, hundreds and hundreds of years. Yeah, I love this sarcophagus cover. It has this slightly cheeky, stylized face, which I sadly missed with the camera. Now you start to see a Greco-Roman influence. I believe that's Bess on the right there, the cheeky goblin-looking god, along with a mummy of a cat, different instruments, a statue of a bull. And there was an interesting temple cult around bulls. There's even the Seraphim, which I haven't had a chance to go to. I hope to get there one day. Really good selection of items from for a medium-sized city. It really is a very good collection, and well worth a visit if you have any interest in Egyptian. Another mummy here with the gilded face. It makes you realise how many people are mummified. As you go around these museums, you see so many mummies. I think the Egyptian Grand Museum has about 15 or 20 pharaohs, and I lost count of the number of mummies. But also there's things like the Mummification Museum in Thebes, or pretty much every major museum that has world history in the whole of Europe and Americas. In this area is the intersection of Greece and Egypt when the Ptolemies ruled. And we saw one of these geometric wrappings. There's a beautiful one of a child there, and they've actually got MRI scan cross sections which just didn't capture on the camera. It's very striking and effective. Then straight from the intersection of Egypt and Greece into Greece itself, and particularly Cyprus, there's an excellent collection of pottery from there. You can see the shards and reconstructed. I love that sort of almost drinking horn there, and the vases that are in the shape of people, along with some metalwork, spears, daggers, amphora. You can see a tablet there, which again shows that sort of cross-pollination of ideas across cultures in this area and this period. Must have been quite close links with trade with Egypt. And you start to see more sophisticated patterns and shapes and forms on the pottery. You could spend hours reading all of the annotations on these pieces, from the coins and burial goods and pots and amphoras. So there's cabinet after cabinet of beautiful Greek archaeological finds. There's an excellent explanation of where everything was found. And you see, this is 1000 BC to 200 AD. In the centre there, that god with that cichlid face, very instantly recognisable as an Aegean early Greek representation of a deity. And these beautiful pieces of gold and precious metals that have been shaped and beaten. And here, the first of the Greek vases we see with that black and terracotta design that we're so familiar with. There's a very good explanation of how they were made at the Fitzwilliam Museum, if you check out our video on that. I love these sort of everyday wares like the horseman, or down at the bottom there's representations of different animals. But there's a certain naivety to them when you compare them to these figures of humans up above, or certainly those on the right. And there's a large collection of statuettes that were found in a sanctuary. I imagine these to be not quite like shabtis, but representations of everyday life within the temple. You can see there's music, not too much unlike a church or temple today. In the centre, a collection of interesting pieces. Doesn't look very Greek, does he? Not with that beard. Looks much more Persian. Beautiful designs on these pots. And we just get a sneak view at the far end of probably the star of this gallery, Poseidon. But beautiful examples of Cretan art and Cypriot Greek art. And along with these busts of Greek philosophers is these beautiful melamorpha. They're black and terracotta coloured with a very detailed, stylized drawing. I love how you can sort of see the ruffles in the robes, and here a drinking horn in the shape of a ram. Look at that, beautiful, really elaborate pieces. You could see a level of artistry developing which really was what probably set Greece apart in many ways for when the British were putting a lot of these museums together. There's always a concentration on the ancient world. There was an admiration for the artistry, culture, philosophy, and style of these groups, whereas we built things like Stonehenge and Silbury Hill, but they don't really get as much of a mention in the grand museums that were built in the 17th and 18th century. Because this was seen as the giants on whose shoulders we were standing. And you can see why there's an admiration for this artistry. It's quite beautiful pieces and a very particular style. Much copied. Obviously these are all original. I love the little amphora at the top there, which we just captured for a moment. And you see those little knuckle bones? Knuckle bones were used for games, much like dice are today in much of the ancient world. We see them in Greece, Rome, and even in Britain under the Romans. You find these little knuckle bones from animals that were used for gaming and entertainment. But very beautiful collection of pieces here. And a helmet. I love that helmet. It's very worn and rugged. And it's seen better days. But this is a 1,000-year-old helmet buried in the ground for probably 700 years. A very well curated collection of Greek artefacts here. Sort of tastefully limited, not a huge number of middling artefacts, but a small number of very high quality artefacts. And some are in such excellent condition. Here a sarcophagus. And we're getting to Poseidon. Poseidon is really good. Beautiful raised reliefs. Tomb wear, everyday wear. Fascinating little Greek helmeted heads. And you see this warrior's helmet with the skull that wore it. Beautiful grave wear of elaborate gold jewellery, ironwork, ironware, armour plate there. The ladle. I'm quite fascinated by the ladle. There's several of them here. You see that gold breastplate jewellery. And these are from around the Mediterranean world, because the Greeks settled a large portion of Mediterranean. They had trading sites in Turkey, Spain, Algeria, Morocco. And here's Poseidon. This wonderful piece. He's missing his trident, but you can see the firmness of the musculature, the detailing of the bronze. And there's cabinets full of this black and terracotta ware, very instantly recognisable as Greek. You could see them fighting, wrestling. There's even a man wrestling a wild animal, riding horses, fighting in armour. And you can see that armour in the cabinets here. So you can also identify which of the city-states of Greece they were from by the way that their armour is designed. And if you like the vases, there's an excellent display here where they talk about the designs of the vases and the way that they're analysed. And here, I love these small, they're libations for the dead, they're offerings. Much as I referred to the libations earlier in the Egyptian section, think of it as precious oils, like, the three wise men myrrh. And they explain how these libation jars, because the oils were expensive, they had false floors inside them, so they weren't quite as large as they look. Imagine if you had a magnum of champagne, but you couldn't afford to fill it with champagne, and you just have a very small amount of liquid inside, but it looks like you've got plenty of money to splash about. And a cabinet of these wonderful bronze works. You see here these musical horns. They almost look Viking in their design. Long, arcing horns. And there's a reason they're almost Viking, because they are. Maybe not entirely, but this is ancient Ireland. And you have these beautiful bronze work. Spears. You see the spear with the ridge down the centre. You see that design evolving during the Bronze Age. And a torque around the neck, a symbol of power. More spears and tools and hooks. There's even somewhere here a mould. There it is. That is a mould for an axe. And you don't see them very often. I saw one at the Wiltshire Museum, and it's lovely to see them. They're a stone carved axe, but not the typical knapped flint, almost spearhead style, but actually carved in the shape that you see more with a bronze tool. Here, pottery and ironwork. Beautiful gold work. These axe heads, it almost looks like a pickaxe that's evolved today, but with the heads at two different angles, sort of one horizontal, one vertical. And you see these gods and these carved axe heads. These are more symbolic axe heads. They've been beautifully carved and polished to almost shine like a mirror. Different flint work and harpoon, little fishing hooks. And there I went for it too quickly, but there's a very interesting one of those Mother Earth goddess figures, I think from Mesopotamia. And here is a really interesting display. There's a cabinet of different types of progenitors of Homo sapiens, but an excellent Neanderthal and Denisovan. And really, if you're interested in that, check out the second of the Natural History Museum videos. They have a really good collection of ancient human skulls. Then we're into Rome. Roman coins, each one having an intricate and distinct and understood meaning from the way the emperor was shown. Different jewellery. This is Iron Age Britain, so good pieces from Iron Age Britain of coins and tokens. So, you know, we had coins before the Romans. They didn't bring everything. These beautiful ironwork. That looks like the bridle work for a horse. If you see Richborough Roman fort has a very good Roman example of that. And a mix of different tools. There's these antlers, because when you see a henge like Stonehenge, the ditch was actually dug out by hand. Well, they didn't use their fingers, they used tools. And antlers were one of the most common used for that. And there's a good explanation of how you lift a stone in terms of how close or how far and how it changes the force on the fulcrum. Here, a reconstruction of some ancient British houses. Obviously, they're wooden and long gone, but we've dug them up at places like Durrington Walls, which we'll have to do a video on soon. And it's fascinating to see the different range of shapes and designs of axes and, to a degree, spears evolving during the Bronze Age. See a bronze helmet, shield, sword, spearhead, even the greaves from the armour. Up above, not really captured, is a statue in bronze. And they're still building things. Not everything's bronze. There were other options were available. Always loved these old mirrors. You can imagine the crafting and polishing that was required in them. And these little pottery animal lamps there. Because now we're getting into Italy before the Romans. We always think of Italy as being Rome. It's, you know, the common consciousness, Rome was the culture. But before the Romans was the Etruscans, and the Etruscans were a city-state like Rome, but they were more highly evolved and complicated during their era, and you can see different funeral goods and grave goods. They buried in these interesting terracotta vessels. You do occasionally see a really beautiful sarcophagus, and there they have more like pot burials, but also bronze. Interesting collection of ivory and bronze animals and carvings. You can see how, on the one hand, Rome sort of culturally evolved from this, on the other hand, was quite different tradition. Now we're into Rome itself, and you have helmets and vases. You can immediately see in the pottery there's influence from the Greek world. The Romans really looked up to the Greeks. And here's the Roman world. It is immense. The whole of the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, different eras, all the way around Turkey and Anatolia, Egypt, up to the Black Sea, right over to cold old Britain. It's a very good write-up. I mean, I didn't realise they reached Budapest. And over here, different carvings and memorials, reliefs from graves. Here, glasswork, bronze work, pottery. There's a finery and a level of detail about the Roman work. It's very impressive. And pieces from the home. So here you have, I mean, that looks like something you could get at B&Q today, doesn't it? It's not, doesn't look like a 2,000-year-old garden decoration. And then on the left there, we saw a god. You see the Romans were very good at adopting other people's gods and adapting, moulding them to fit into their pantheon. Here you have the parts of the things from around the house. So you have things from the atrium, decorations, beautiful pottery with these raised slipware decorations, and that sort of pimple reminds me of the grape vases that you see in Neolithic Britain. Here, hair decorations and hairpins, brooches, jewellery, necklaces, rings, decorations, oil lamps. There's a little bit of everything Roman here, and the glasswork is very good there. Now, someone's going to know who that god is and tell me that that's not an example of an adopted god, but almost in its pose, it doesn't particularly strike me as Roman. Love all these little ironwork tools, from tongs to tweezers to cutters to blades to scrapers. Cleanliness was very important to the Romans. You have the Roman baths, and there was the whole process by which they clean themselves with oils and scraping and heat and cold and water and libations, all of which required accessories. Here there's a section on gladiators, explanations and entertainment. So that sort of theatrical head there, lamps, reliefs, busts, all talking about Rome and gladiatorial and entertainment, and that sort of side of Roman culture. It's not really time to show everything, but mosaics and roof tiles and every element of Roman life broken down into a cabinet with a good explanation and some interesting pieces. And I particularly like this bridal work from a horse that we're going to see in a moment. It is a very good example of Roman bridal work, much more complete than other examples I've seen, because normally you'd only see part of it, but here this is a very complete set of the chains to control actually a bull, I believe, not a horse, and an excellent case of pewter plates. I mean, even through to the 18th century, or to some degree 19th century, these were quite common items. But it's fascinating to see examples of pewter plates dating back to the Roman occupation of Britain, with another cabinet of pottery. And in this corridor between the Roman world and the next room is a selection of beautiful relief carvings. Just such good examples. You see there the level of detail and the depth in the carvings. They're really stunning pieces, and you could see very rich in meaning as well as detail. These are casts, much like the cast courts at the V&A, which we're going to be visiting closer to Christmas. But maybe a bit maligned in museums today. The idea is you should only show the real thing. But this room and the cast courts at the V&A really won me over to the idea of plaster cast, so long as it's clear that that's what you're looking at. Because here you have a very large collection of interesting items that you couldn't possibly have a museum have all of these different pieces, and you can paint them. And that's something the Ashmoleans done on a few pieces tastefully and interestingly, but they've painted them to give an idea of what Roman and to a degree Greek statuary was like. It's easy to visit museums and see Greek and Roman statues and think, well, they were just carved stone. They looked very beautiful. But it gives a totally different perspective when you see one painted as it's believed they were originally quite often. And it's actually a gaudy and quite shocking, almost over-the-top coloration. It shows a different perspective on the artwork, because you see these as idyllic examples of classical civilization above such things as gaudy, strong paints. And then you see this statue on the right, which, well, it's not tastefully painted, is it? It's rather in your face. I love this boar. It reminds me of the boar in the market on the bridge in Florence. Very striking large piece, and I believe the original might have been bronze, but beautiful. And there you see the gaudy colours. Now, from a distance, that would have been very striking then. But if I was to paint an original Roman statue like that, I'd probably be arrested for vandalism. So it's interesting to see these plaster casts giving a different perspective on classical art. It's not just about striking nose and the curls of the hair and the musculature of the wrestler or whatever the subject is, but actually these were statement pieces. And also here they've coloured the Greek writing so you can actually make out what it says, because without that, unless you've got better eyes than me, you really can't read it. Greek statue. So skipping past a dozen masterpieces for the sake of time, there's a really lovely little model of the Parthenon, and it shows the Parthenon as it was before modern times, before it was rebuilt. And you can see 1895, that's what the Parthenon looked like after the Venetian siege and the Turkish storing dynamite there and various abuses of what actually was a Christian church and a mosque by that point. Anyway, then we're straight off into the Indian section. Moderately sized collection, but some very good pieces. I love these wall reliefs and statues. You see the Buddhist statues there. And there's quite a good collection of Buddhist India here. Interesting carved pieces from temples. Coping stone there. For the top of a roof. Wall. Here, different demons, deities, spirits, gods. The Chinese section here tries to do justice to a very complicated subject. You have a Chinese gallery from AD 800. So really you've got a range of pottery and designs, and even before the first emperor of Qin, through different empires and dynasties, a change in style. There's a thematic consistency. The shape of a vase looks very Chinese versus the Greek ones look very Greek. But there is a stylistic change in how they were designed and portrayed. There's a great little collection of Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Assyrian. I like these. These are part of the wall decoration. They were like cylindrical tubes that narrow at one end that were pressed into the wall, and they formed like a mosaic across the wall of the temple. There's a good explanation of the history and a decent selection of items. If you particularly like Assyrian, Mesopotamian, the whole Fertile Crescent, you should check out the second video on the British Museum, which really does have the best collection that I've seen in Western Europe. Another of those mace heads there. I find them fascinating because they crop up everywhere. And some good examples of seals. And this is one last thing from this gallery, is a wall decoration. So it's like a pottery flower on a tube that's pressed into the wall to form a three-dimensional decoration on the wall. And that's something I've not seen anywhere in Syrian exhibitions. There's a couple of galleries of interesting collectibles, particularly from the Renaissance here. One in the corner there, what looks like the helmet of the Knights who say "Nye" in the Monty Python, The Holy Grail, is actually reputed to be the lantern that was carried into Parliament when Guy Fawkes went to burn it. That was his lantern. And it does have very good pedigree, so it probably is. And along here, a bunch of interesting bows, weapons, crossbow, what look like knobkerries there on the wall. Beautiful shell work that's intricately carved. Very interesting collection of unusual items. Skipping an interesting gallery on money, we're straight through to one of my favourites on this floor, the Japanese. And there's this wonderful selection of ceremonial kimonos. I love this one with the storks in 3D raised silk on it. these elaborate patterns. And it's a collection from Kabuki Theatre, and it's a really large collection of beautiful pieces, along with a lot of historical items and scrolls and something completely unrelated to Japan, Columbarum. This museum is eclectic. We're going to get back to Japan, and there's a room here of beautiful Chinese, Korean, and Japanese pottery. Very substantial collection there. Some very good examples. And it's all split by dynasty and region and explained very well. But just round this corner, past more and more kimonos, is something every young lad likes to see in a museum. A really excellent samurai armour. This is from 1560s, the helmet, and the rest of it's from the 1700s. And it's a magnificent suit of armour from a high status warrior. Along with, you can see the swords at the front, and there's a carrying case at the side. Really lovely example. The swords are really something. And it's quite the draw in this room. Highlighted as one of the 10 best things to see in the museum. Oh, being cheeky, we've skipped the gallery, which has quite a decent collection, including Turner, Canaletto. I particularly like the Canaletto, but you may have gathered from my other gallery videos that I love Canaletto. And here is a gallery of beautiful Renaissance instruments, and particularly there is a Stradivarius, which is one of the big draws in this room. But they're very beautiful pieces. These are about 300, 400 years old, depending on the piece. Beautifully carved, beautifully detailed. Still some of the best examples. And some of them you can see they're not quite the normal shape of a violin or viola, because they're slightly older versions of the instrument. But that is a Stradivarius. That's what a Stradivarius looks like. Perfection in wood. Unfortunately, you can't hear it or play it. Look at the tuning knobs. You know, you have a violin or a cello today and it costs hundreds of pounds, and you get a bland, boring tuning knob. Look at just the detailing on those there. They're gorgeous. And these are guitarellas. They're like precursors of the guitar. Not a mandolin or a lyre, or a lute, but a type of predecessor of guitar. And on the wall there's a very interesting explanation of how a violin is made, and gives you some sense of why an artisan's violin is worth so much. We're moving on now to a last room we're going to see today, and this is the room that I remember as a child. I remember coming here when I was probably just about a teenager, and this room was the one that captured my imagination because I'd never seen Aegean civilization other than in books. So you have those Cycladic statues. They're very strange, anthropomorphic, semi-human, almost naive art depictions in a very stylized way. Unlike Sir Arthur Evans here, who seems very self-assured of his place in history as the finder of most of the artefacts in this room. Here, this beautiful amphoric vase. And there's a very good explanation of his dig at Knossos. The finds here. Now, I feel like one of the vases is missing because I remember a very impressive octopus vase. Maybe it's like chocolate bars. They weren't as big as you think they were when you were a kid, but I seem to think there was a couple more vases and they were very large. Possibly reconstructions. That might be what's happened and they've removed them. But you have this like throne-like chair, this wonderful octopus vase with the intricate design in the glaze, the palm fronds on that one. Then you have different items from the dig at Knossos. This wonderful giant vase. I could like stand inside it. It's so big. And there's a really good selection of items from this very particular element of the Greeks. And they were Greek. Well, if you think back to the Odyssey, the Greeks weren't Greeks, the Greeks were Archaeans. And within that group, there was King Minos, the king of the Minoans. And he is probably a mythic figure, or he's lost to time. But when Knossos was found, it was taken as being the Minos and place of the Minotaur, and there was a maze there. There's a whole bunch of items from here. It was a big splash when it was found in the 1920s, and it was definitely linked to that whole Homeric story of Troy and the Minoans. And here, this wonderful set of daggers from Mycenae, and here this mask of gold, its wonderful death mask. Here a string of fascinating stone and pottery carvings, wonderful little pieces, a slightly different branch to the mainland Greeks. There was a different cultural evolution at this point. They were like cousins, and it very well explains and catalogues, and is, I think, the best collection I've seen dealing with Mycenaean and Minoan civilization. Really wonderful collection here, and I think a great place to finish our tour of the Ashmolean, because yeah, we've just popped over the hour, and it's a long video, but it's a large museum and there's a lot to see. And I would say, come to the Ashmolean, visit it. Just before I say any more, look at those wonderful, that goddess with the snakes. It's that iconic, and not just because of the, but it's the iconic image of that civilization. There's much we don't know about them, but if you want to know about them, this museum's definitely a great starting point. And do like, subscribe, it really helps us with our videos. And come back next week. Saturday we'll have a history. Thursday we may have an occasional medium video, and we'll definitely have another museum Monday next Monday. And if you've made it through an hour, you know you need to subscribe.